Firstly, thanks, David, and thanks, Joelle, for your passion and expertise. It's great to be at a conference like this and be able to hear from the experts. All of that's a bit scary for me because, of course, I'm not a scientist and I don't have the same expertise, and listening to Joelle talk reminded me of, I try to keep a really close tab on the science, but it always reminds me of the things I don't know. And that's really the crux of what I want to leave with you today, my 15 minutes, is, look, it is a bit intimidating, this climate change space, because we're not scientists, but the message I want to leave you with is there is a really important role for us. A lot of what needs to be done is what I'd call kind of financial quantification, and we're talking long time periods and we're talking uncertainty, and the skills that we've got are actually really well placed to play an important role. So I'm going to try and demonstrate that by talking about some of the things that I've been doing. My apologies that they are mostly kind of general insurance specific things, but they're really just intended to show you, and I think they translate to other areas to show you that we do have a role. That's the wrong button. What better place to start than with the Australian Actuaries Climate Index? Hopefully most of you have had a bit of a look at this by now. It's tracking the frequency of extreme weather conditions at different places around Australia. We're talking temperature and rainfall and dry days and sea levels. There's 6 measures in total. That's the latest version. The last bar there you'll see in the red bar that sits at about 0.8. That is the result for the summer of 2019. As Joelle said, and by the way, this is tracking the top 1% of days. So Joelle showed us a chart that was tracking the top 10%. This is tracking the top 1% of days. That summer of 2019 was the period when we had, as Joelle said, we had average temperatures are about 1 degree higher. We actually had triple the number of extreme heat days. So as a measure of, perhaps one way of putting this index is, the BOM at the time, at the culmination of summer, came out with their report, and they talked about the fact that temperatures on average had been a degree higher, and this is really focusing on what happened to the extremes in that particular time frame, and they were actually triple average across Australia. Also, the index shows quite nicely the extreme rainfall we had in the tropics when you drill down to it. Look, this is mostly, in my view at this stage, about getting information out there. I often get asked the question, what do you do with it? And that's why I really hope that the next step I'd like to see is us taking this index and turning it into a risk index. So understanding that link between the weather observations we're seeing and the risk, so that we can indeed say we've built an index that's not just tracking something that's linked to risk, but we are actually tracking the risk. We're actually tracking how the bushfire risk is changing and how the mortality risk is changing, because we're understanding the drivers of that and we're tracking them over time. So that's the first good example of we've got a role of getting stuff in the public domain. If I start at a very top number, it'd be nice to know what the cost of climate change is in terms of damage to property. This is something that came out from the Climate Council just a couple of weeks ago. They had this number here, the total average annual risk cost, 85 billion. You can see there, total average annual, 85 billion. That's a big number. If you like, the average insured costs from natural disasters in Australia, it's running at about 2.5 billion, something of that magnitude. So look, I just think that's a big number. That's by 2030. This is where I think this is stuff we know a lot about. We know about the cost of disasters. Some of us are working with it all the time, and I think we've got a role to play to get information out there about what the property damage costs are. And that's something, the Institute has done that in the past via various papers, and perhaps there's a bit more we can be doing as well. But that really, for me, illustrates the fact that it's a specific expertise that we have that we can bring to play, this quantification of the risk. Now, linking to that is we're now in the era of climate risk disclosures. So they've started, this is Westpac's 2018 disclosures, where they said they had 1.7% of their portfolio would be high risk by 2050 under a pretty extreme scenario. So if you think about that work, there was a key part of it that involved what's the climate going to look like in 2050? So what are the conditions that will be driving cost? Then someone had to turn those conditions into, well, what's going to be happening to the property damage cost? And that's a kind of a first step. And then once you've done that, well, how's that going to impact on credit risk? Because that's primarily what the bank's concerned with. So there's two components of that are essentially financial quantification, converting the weather conditions to property damage, and then thinking about how that property damage impacts on the credit risk, which is why the number 1.7% is quite low, and that's because it's about that assessment of how has the credit risk changed, which is not necessarily the same as how has the property damage changed. So I'm pleased to say Actuaries were involved in that work. Thank you, Sharanjit, was kind of key to all of that. And this kind of quantification is something we're going to be getting more involved with in future. So I think it's another good example of, as companies are looking to quantify the risk, we are perfectly well placed to be supporting with that. Just a little bit more detail on that. This is something that I've done at Plenary, and again, it's a good example of how we've engaged with the scientists, because all of this quantification piece involves us as actuaries. We need to engage with the science, and we need to therefore overcome that intimidation factor. So we need to be curious about it, and we need to ask lots of questions, and then we need to work out how does that our understanding of that science then translate into different risk. So at Plenary, we've got these address level pricing models. This is our cyclone model. So for each house in Australia, we have a view about the current cost of cyclone. So we went to the scientists at the University of Newcastle, their Centre for Water, Climate and Land, and we said, can you kind of help us understand what the current research is saying about how climate risk may impact on cyclone costs in future? And that's kind of the summary on the left-hand side in terms of changes to frequency, severity, rainfall, slower moving, the fact that there's the polar shift, and so they're coming further south, and the fact they're slower moving, so they're going to be dropping more rain. So we kind of talked with them about that, and then we actually rebuilt our model to reflect those change conditions, and we were then able to measure how much the risk varies by. So this is an assessment of that to individual homes. So if we have a look at, say, the homes that have got a claims cost of $2,000 or more, that's the current cost there. It's about 0.1% of all Australian homes, and it's going to about 0.5% under this specific scenario that we've chosen. So a five-fold increase in those that are paying more than $2,000, or sorry, where the claims cost is more than $2,000. So again, a perfect example that we can get involved in engaging with the science and then using it to quantify. This is something some of you may have done already. I've been doing this with some companies is they say, well, how is climate change going to impact on my business? So we can help them with an assessment of the impact to the business. There's kind of asset side impacts and there's liability side impacts. So if I was looking at the liability side impacts, I'd be looking at, well, how has the frequency of catastrophes increased? So how are the claims costs changing? And both, how is that impacting my average annual cost, but what does it do to my PML? So I'd be having a think about that stuff. I'd then be looking at, well, how am I currently managing that? And there's actually a lot insurers are doing currently, to some extent inadvertently, to manage that risk. And of course, that's they buy reinsurance and they price an address level to deal with the properties that are more exposed to say, cyclone and flood. And they're also the properties to some extent that are more exposed to climate change impacts. So some of the insurers are dealing with that stuff, whether deliberately or not, to kind of mitigate their risk. And then there's, of course, the ability that insurers have to general insurers change prices on an annual basis. So in theory, if they're tracking how that risk is changing, they can be responding in their pricing over time. So you can kind of document what an insurer's doing to understand that. And then there's, of course, well, what else might they be doing? Where are the gaps in the current work? I suspect some of you in your financial condition reports may have thought, well, one year I might have a bit of a focus on climate risk. And that's the kind of stuff I can imagine to be putting in there in respect to the liability side and a different set of issues on the asset side. But again, I think we are really well placed to be helping companies assess that risk. The last one that I feel quite strongly about and think we've got a really important role to play is about these affordability issues. So Australia has a significant affordability challenge now. And I'm talking about the ability of individuals to afford to cover their home for the natural peril claims costs. I've done some work that suggests it's around 5% of homes have an affordability problem. They're primarily homes in cyclone-prone and flood areas and in particular where they're in low socio-economic groups. That makes up most of that 5%. They've got a problem now, and a lot of them aren't insured. And that problem is going to get much, much worse. So that's something that we've got a good idea about, that we're going to have the affordability issue we currently have is going to become more of a problem. So Australia at some point is going to have to grapple with that. Up until now, governments have shown a total reluctance to look in detail at pooling levels. I'd say that generally the insurers have kind of shown a reluctance as well. I think that's going to have to change at some stage. And I think we as actuaries are really well placed to support with that. And if I have a look at some of the key reviews that have been done so far, I mean, John Trowbridge was involved with the National Disaster Insurance Review. That was a review that occurred after the 2011 floods in Brisbane. And I really liked the design of the scheme they came up with in that case, whereby it didn't apply to new properties, only existing properties, and it had a limited time frame that the scheme applied for. And it involved cross-subsidisation, essentially, for once the property got beyond a certain level. There were some aspects of that were really nice, that personally I liked. At the time, it was ditched in favour of spending increased money on mitigation, which has barely happened. I was fortunate enough to be involved with the Northern Australian Insurance Premiums Task Force. So that was a report Treasury did, looking at a bunch of schemes and what type of pooling arrangement, if supported by government, could work. Again, that report came out in favour of spending more money on mitigation as opposed to getting involved with a fund. And the Australian Government Actuaries did some really good reports as well, looking at the extent of affordability faced by people up in North Queensland. So I think there are examples that, again, actuaries are heavily involved in this space. There's a lot more that we can do. We've got, and I'm really pleased, InShit set up the Climate Change Working Group. And there's a lot going on there that kind of goes beyond this. As I said, I've focused on the general insurance areas. But I suppose the key message I want to leave you with is that climate change is something we can really get involved with. And that means we need to kind of overcome this intimidation factor. We don't understand all the science ourselves, but we've got plenty of people that we can talk to help us understand it, so we can engage with them. And then we are really well placed to take that and start making some decisions that help corporations and potentially help there's the education component that I think we're involved with, and potentially we can also help government with policy setting. Thank you.